largest marine oil spill in U.S. history, and that project was owned by BP or British Petroleum. Dr. Shaw, what do you say is at fault here?
So BP pled guilty to corporate manslaughter, which is for killing the 11 people who were on the rig at the time. And they also pled guilty to a number of environmental crimes. And again, paid a huge amount of money in fines and settlements. And the main issue there is not so much like in the Dieselgate case where you've got an active crime. You've got someone creating a software, implementing it in the cars so that it cheats the tests. That is a very active, crime. Whereas with the others, with Deepwater, what you have is negligence. So you have people not doing things, not making sure that the protocols are adhered to, not making sure that dissenting voices on the rig, which were saying, this seems problematic, our tests are coming back not safe. Like, it doesn't feel like we're safe to leave this rig, which is what happened. So basically the way that oil is explored in high seas is that you've got the well underneath, you've got the ship, which has the rig on it, and then you have this basically really big straw that goes really deep into the ocean, and then through the floor of the sea, through rock, like way kilometers and kilometers and kilometers down, until you hit the oil well. And this crew was there to just make sure that they tap it, and then they were going to leave, and another crew was going to come and actually get the oil out so that it could be refined and sold. And they were in that moment where they were about to leave, and what you have to do is you have to plug the hole so it doesn't just start gushing out. And they had used this specific cement, and they had done these pressure readings, which came back saying it's not safe to leave. But then someone on board said, no, I've seen this kind of thing before. I call it a bladder effect. And no one else on the board had ever heard of this. So that's important, because these are all highly skilled oil and gas engineers. But they're all like, okay, I guess. And at this point, they're massively over budget, they're running late, they're under pressure. And so you could say that it was also the answer they wanted. They wanted someone to say, actually, we're good to go. And so they accepted it, and they started removing all the equipment, and that's when the rig exploded, because the pressure readings were correct, as in the pressure was too high, and that's why it exploded.
Where was the oversight, though?
Well, the oversight arguably is in that inability for people who were worried about the pressure to actually voice their concerns and to stop this proceeding from happening. And so that's where you get into issues of compliance, you get into ulterior motives, and you get into, and ulterior motives I mean in the sense of, you really want to get home to your family, you really want to get off this rig, you know you're costing the company a lot of money, and it's probably going to be fine, because every other time in your life it's been fine, and so you're highly motivated to believe things that are untrue. And so actually in Great Crime, in my book, that chapter ends up being quite a lot about the psychology of why people don't believe facts, even their own, because that's what happened here, is they generated their own data and then they chose to disregard them. And I think that's fascinating, and it happens all the time. And so the question is, how do we change our minds in the face of things that we don't want to hear?
That
And
sounds
so
like climate change.
It is. Well, it totally is.
So the answer is?
Well, the answer is partly that we need to speak the language of the people who are trying to change the minds of, and that includes using words. So, like, in some contexts, I just don't use words like sustainable. I use words instead like risk, or long-term versus short-term gain, or profitability. But again, I use those words in a very selective way, because I know that other words that are associated with environmental conversations trigger a defensive response in some people. And so if you just avoid those words, you can actually kind of have the same conversations.
The cover-up of just how much oil was gushing into the ocean was in some ways even worse, and a scientist did try to alert people to it. It seems like this is what you were just talking about. Can you tell me briefly about him and what happened?
Yeah, so I spoke with Ian McDonald, who was the oil specialist, the oil scientist who studied oil seeps in the Gulf of Mexico. So these are natural sources of oil that are constantly sort of leaking into the Gulf of Mexico anyway, but they're very slow. So this is really slow drip. And actually these are areas of high biodiversity, which surprised me. And basically you've got laughing because it's so obviously untrue that you could see it happening, and yet they were like, no, it's not. And then they slowly kept adjusting their statement, being like, no, actually a bit is coming out. Oh, actually a bit more. Actually a bit more. And then the scientists looked at the flyover data of just planes that were just looking at how the oil looked from the surface and how far it had gone. And he sat down, he calculated what that meant. And he was like, the rate that they are giving us is multiple times below what it has to be. And he put pressure on the company by going public with this. And he was, I mean, in some ways, he really is a hero as well, because he said that he tried to publish this in an academic journal, and the editor was like, we're not publishing that. And he's like, well, but I need to say something. But I also don't want my career to be ruined if I'm wrong, or if I'm labeled a climate doomist. And he did it anyway. And then it turned out actually people were ready to hear it, and he actually even underestimated it. There's even more than he had estimated. And he ended up speaking up in front of Congress about these rates. So scientists are really important in making sure that the data we're getting are actually correct.
In this case, there was an effective cleanup, and corporations, including BP, British Petroleum, paid multi-million dollars in fines and cleanup costs. But I'm just wondering what kind of a difference that makes when you see BP willing to try again. It just recently asked for another license to drill even deeper in the same area.
I think that the risk comes in not changing the culture around being able to speak up, and in underestimating the harm that what you are doing is in fact doing. I would hope that BP has learned. And actually, and this is where the fines that BP paid went into cleaning up the Gulf of Mexico, went into funding a huge amount of research, including psychological research, on the consequences of the oil spill for the local community. But, and this is what I think is such a promising aspect of this, because there was so much research and so much money spent on basically fixing what they destroyed, and it's one of the most studied natural areas in the world. So it really shows that those fines can be put to incredible use, both in terms of repairing the harm and also in terms of advancing our knowledge of these issues in general.
Now, often environmental crimes just don't get the same attention or degree of punishment as crimes like murder. Do you think they should be considered as crimes on the same level?
Yes, I think they should definitely be considered on the same level as other kinds of crimes. And I mean that psychologically, and I mean that legally. So I think we need to equalize the way that we think about and punish the people who are destroying environmental ecosystems, water, air, and we need to think about them in the same way as we think about violent criminals or other criminals. And until we do that, I think people are going to think that this is not as bad. That destroying a forest, that poisoning a river, that leaching toxic chemicals into a local community is somehow not as bad as directly harming humans, even though it is still harming humans, but indirectly. And so this is where